The room is dark, the air damp with the smell of sea salt and mildew. A candle flickers weakly, throwing jagged shadows across the low ceiling of Longwood House on St Helena. On the bed lies a figure who was once the master of Europe, now shrunken, pale, almost unrecognizable. His skin clings to bone, his stomach burns, as though fire itself has been poured into him. Sweat beads on his brow. A tuft of once proud black hair comes loose in his trembling fingers, and he stares at it with horror, as if the strands themselves are whispering betrayal. He whispers, voice hoarse, each word dragging out like the echo of a ghost. "They are poisoning me." His eyes dart around the dim room, toward the wineglass at his bedside, toward the shadows beyond the door, toward the servants who hover nervously. His suspicion spares no one. In his final hours, Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who brought kings to their knees, is convinced he has been betrayed, murdered not by bullet or blade, but by something insidious, something invisible. Outside the Atlantic pounds relentlessly against the black rocks of the island, as though the ocean itself were sealing his prison. The cries of gulls pierce the heavy silence, a cruel reminder that the world moves on while he rots away in obscurity. His attendants exchange glances, helpless, terrified, as the emperor groans and clutches his abdomen. Some pray. Others simply watch, unable to deny the terrible question forming in their minds. Is this natural death or slow execution? The irony is suffocating. This man, who once crowned himself emperor in the golden halls of Notre Dame, who dictated the destinies of nations, now lies in a bed soaked with sweat, his breath shallow, his mind consumed by paranoia. The end does not come with the thunder of cannon or the clash of armies, but with a whisper of poison, drop by drop, wearing him down until all that remains is agony. His face twists as another wave of pain grips him. He groans a sound not of power, but of defeat of a body unraveling from within. The candle sputters, and in that fragile glow, the question burns brighter than ever. Who wanted him dead so desperately that they could not let him waste away in peace? The British jailers fearful of his return, the Bourbons desperate to silence the living symbol of the revolution. Or someone closer, someone who shared his bread and wine. Napoleon gasps the word France, slipping from his lips like a final prayer. His hand falls limp at his side. The storm outside swells louder, as if the world itself is holding its breath. In this lonely room, far from Paris, far from glory, an emperor dies in suspicion, pain, and shadow. And yet, what if he was right? What if history's greatest conqueror was not merely defeated, but poisoned, murdered in slow motion by invisible hands? The answer to that question still lingers in the air, in the silence that follows, daring us to look deeper into the darkness of Saint Helena. Before the damp air of exile, before the shadows of Saint Helena closed in, there was light, blinding golden light. Imagine the echo of drums, the rustle of silk gowns, the thunder of hooves across cobbled courtyards. Paris bowed to one man. From the Tuileries to the marble steps of Notre Dame, the world seemed sculpted in his image. Napoleon Bonaparte, once a Corsican outsider, now crowned Emperor of the French, strode through halls where mirrors reflected not only splendor, but destiny itself. The courts shimmered with jewels, voices whispered behind lace fans, and every gesture, every nod, every glance was a performance of power. Nobles, generals, and ministers alike lived in the orbit of a man whose very presence dictated the rhythm of Europe. He carried himself not merely as a ruler, but as the axis around which history turned. In palaces heavy with velvet and candlelight, the empire's glory seemed eternal. Even enemies whispered his name with fear. And yet beyond the gilded thrones and glittering banquets, his true kingdom was not of marble but of fire and steel. His stage was the battlefield. Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram, their names still ring with thunder. Picture him astride a horse cloak, whipping in the wind, cannons thundering at his command. Columns of soldiers marched at his word, their tricolour banners slicing through smoke like lightning. He was not merely a general, he was myth made flesh, the revolution reborn in a single man's will. But amid this grandeur lay a cruel irony. The higher he climbed, the narrower the air became. Every victory chained him tighter to his legend. Every coronation, every treaty, every conquered city became another link in the golden cage he forged with his own hands. Europe admired, feared, and hated him in equal measure. His palaces gleamed, but their walls echoed with suspicion. Even as he held court, he could feel the weight of the crowns he had stolen the eyes of kings waiting for him to stumble. Still within those luminous years, he was untouchable. At court, Josephine's laughter filled the gardens of Malmaison. Later, Marie-Louise brought the promise of dynastic legitimacy. His son, the King of Rome, embodied the future of a dynasty. For a moment, it seemed Napoleon had done the impossible, seized power, love, and legacy, binding them into the architecture of eternity. And yet, if you listen closely beneath the music of waltzes and the clinking of crystal glasses, another sound emerges. It is the faint crack of ice beneath the feet of a skater, the first hairline fracture of a frozen lake. At the height of glory, doom was already stirring. Every triumph carried the seed of downfall. Every ally could become a traitor. The cage was beautiful, yes, but the door would not stay open forever. For the man who once commanded half of Europe would one day be confined to a lonely island cell, stripped of his empire, his freedom, and his health. The grandeur of the past would only make the shadows of his end seem darker still. The fall did not begin with thunder, it began with whispers. After years of unstoppable triumph, the tide of fortune shifted. In the salons of Vienna and London, diplomats leaned across candlelit tables, plotting his undoing. On the streets of Paris, rumors spread like smoke whispers of exhaustion, of discontent, of a man who had reached too far. Napoleon, master of Europe, was no longer invincible. The cracks in the fortress had begun to show. The first true fracture came at Moscow. A brilliant campaign turned to disaster as fire and frost consumed an army once thought immortal. Soldiers who had marched with the pride of gods stumbled back through snow and ice, hollow-eyed and broken. Mothers wept across France. The empire bled men faster than it could replace them. Europe smelled weakness, and when the scent of weakness spreads, wolves gather. The Battle of Leipzig followed the so-called Battle of Nations. Cannons roared across muddy fields, but this time it was not Napoleon who bent nations to his will. It was nations who bent together to break him. Austria, Russia, Prussia, Britain, his enemies, once divided, now united. The myth of invincibility collapsed under the sheer weight of numbers. The eagle's wings were clipped. Paris fell. Napoleon abdicated. Exile to Elba was his sentence, humiliation draped in velvet. Yet even there, the whispers did not cease. His name still carried the weight of fire. Soldiers still dreamed of his banners. In March 1815, he returned, slipping past his captors marching into France. Villagers, then soldiers, then entire regiments rallied to him. The king fled, the throne trembled, and for 100 days Europe held its breath. But destiny is cruel. At Waterloo, the dream ended in mud and rain. British muskets, Prussian reinforcements, and the grinding pressure of fate brought him to his knees. As cannon smoke cleared, he was no longer a lion, but a hunted beast. Captured, defeated, his final chapter was not to be written in Paris, but on a desolate rock in the South Atlantic Saint Helena. It was there, amid damp winds and salt air, that the true seeds of doom took root. At first there were the whispers of illness, a burning in the stomach after meals fatigue that weighed down his once iron body. His attendants noted his skin growing pale, his strength faltering. Perhaps it was nothing, they thought. Perhaps it was the dampness of Longwood House, the prison-like residence assigned by his British jailers. But the pain worsened. His hair grew brittle, thinning with alarming speed. His mind, once sharp as a blade, grew clouded with suspicion. The whispers returned this time from his own lips. "I am being poisoned." A chilling thought. The island was already a prison, its rocks and waves unbreakable walls. But what if his jailers sought more than captivity? What if Saint Helena was not merely his cage, but his tomb? There came a moment when Napoleon understood that Saint Helena was not a temporary station, not a pause before some miraculous return. It was the end. The trap had closed. No battlefield would summon him back. No cavalry charge would rescue him. The ocean itself was his jailer, a vast, merciless moat. Governor Hudson Lowe ensured that every detail of Napoleon's existence was controlled. Visitors were screened, correspondence intercepted, even the smallest comforts denied. Longwood House, with its leaking roof and damp walls, was more dungeon than residence. The Emperor of Europe now slept in rooms filled with mould, the Atlantic winds rattling the shutters like chains. His pride, his greatest armour, was slowly dismantled not by cannon fire, but by daily humiliations. And then came the illness. At first it seemed like the ordinary toll of captivity indigestion, a gnawing discomfort after meals. But the pains grew sharper, more insistent. He began to vomit, often black tarry fluid. His stomach burned like acid. His legs swelled with fluid. He confided to those closest to him that something unnatural was happening inside his body. And though his doctors spoke of ulcers, of cancers, of the ordinary tragedies of flesh, he suspected something else, something deliberate. Arsenic, a poison without taste or smell, capable of mimicking natural disease. A poison that could be slipped into wine, into food, into medicine itself. Too slow to reveal itself as murder, too subtle to ever be proven in his lifetime. Each dose another link in a chain, dragging him toward the grave. Napoleon, once feared for his clarity of thought, now found paranoia gnawing at his mind. Was the cook bribed? Was the wine tampered with? Could he even trust his closest companions? He accused, then withdrew, then accused again. His suspicions became as constant as his pain. And yet, were they madness or terrible truth? Historians would one day study strands of his hair and find alarming traces of arsenic. But in that moment, all Napoleon could feel was betrayal. "They want me gone," he whispered, clutching his stomach. "They want me silenced forever." He knew too much, he symbolized too much. Alive, he was the memory of revolution, the possibility of resurgence. Dead, he was a problem neatly solved. The trap was not only the island, nor the guards, nor Governor Lowe's rigid rules. The true trap was inside him, coursing through his blood. Each day he weakened. Each day he became less emperor and more prisoner. He could see it in the eyes of his attendants, pity replacing awe, helplessness replacing loyalty. The man who had once commanded millions was now at the mercy of something invisible, something he could not fight with sword or strategy. The net had been cast and there was no escape. Napoleon, who once reshaped the world with sheer will, now faced the one enemy he could not outmaneuver, the slow, deliberate hand of death itself. Longwood House became less a residence and more a tomb that refused to close. Its walls dripped with damp, its beams sagged with decay, and the Atlantic winds clawed endlessly at the shutters. Within that suffocating prison, Napoleon's world shrank to a few creaking rooms, a rotting garden, and the endless ache of his own body. For a man who once commanded the horizons of Europe, confinement to a damp hill on a forgotten island was already torture. But now his own flesh betrayed him. He paced the narrow corridors, his once imposing figure reduced to a shadow. He dictated memoirs with feverish intensity, desperate to leave behind words that might outlive him, words that might preserve the myth even as the man withered. At night he spoke of Austerlitz and Jena as though they were yesterday, as if memory itself were the only battlefield left to conquer. But memory could not soften the pain. The gnawing in his stomach worsened, a constant fire that refused to ebb. Suspicion became his companion. He eyed the wine poured into his cup, sniffed the bread on his plate. The servants, the doctors, even his closest companions, any one of them could be the hand of betrayal. Some days he accused openly, other days he withdrew into silence, a wounded animal watching the shadows. His mind, once the sharpest blade in Europe, was dulled by pain and paranoia. And yet, arsenic leaves traces. Centuries later, those traces would be discovered in his very hair, a ghostly confirmation of his darkest fears. The physical torment twisted into psychological anguish. His hair, once dark and full, thinned into brittle strands that broke under his fingers. His legs swelled grotesquely, his gait faltering. At times he could barely rise from bed. The man who once charged with cavalry now struggled to walk across his own chamber. His attendants tried to hide their pity, but he could see it. He could feel the humiliation of weakness gnawing at him more cruelly than the sickness itself. Loneliness deepened the wound. Letters to his family were delayed or censored. News from France came rarely, like drops of water in a desert. The son he had dreamed of moulding into a dynasty grew up far away, a stranger under the watchful eyes of his enemies. He was betrayed not only by poison or politics, but by time itself. His empire had become a memory, his name a whisper in foreign courts. He remained alive, yet history seemed already to be closing its book on him. At night, storms lashed the island, rain rattled the windows, the Atlantic roared like a beast at his door. In those hours lying awake in pain, he must have wondered, was this the end designed for him all along? Not a battlefield death with banners and drums, but a slow disintegration in a forgotten corner of the world. Each morning, he woke weaker, smaller, less himself. This was the true descent into pain, into madness, into obscurity. An emperor, unraveling thread by thread, abandoned to the silence of an island and the steady drip of a poison that no one dared name aloud. The British called it custody. They claimed it was humane. On parchment and in Parliament the language was polished. Napoleon Bonaparte, enemy of peace, was to be safely housed on Saint Helena, where the world might rest assured he would trouble Europe no more. It sounded like order, like justice. Yet inside the walls of Longwood House, the truth was far uglier. Governor Hudson Lowe wrapped his cruelty in rules. He insisted Napoleon was free to live in comfort, but he cut his allowance to the bone. He ordered constant surveillance under the guise of security. He inspected visitors' intercepted letters and smothered any attempt at solace. The emperor, who once dined beneath chandeliers, now ate off chipped plates in a damp dining room. The man who once corresponded with kings now had his words censored like a petty criminal. Justice, the British called it, but Napoleon felt the walls tightening the noose of bureaucracy, strangling him slowly. The doctors were no better. Reports of his illness were contradictory, filled with errors, evasions, and curious omissions. One spoke of liver troubles, another of ulcers, another of cancer. But none addressed the black vomit, the burning stomach, the hair that fell away in clumps. Whether from incompetence or something darker, the medical truth remained hidden. Napoleon himself scoffed, "They wish me to die slowly and call it medicine." Even those closest to him grew cautious. Friends who might have spoken boldly in Paris now kept their silence under Lowe's watchful eye. Requests for better conditions were drowned in endless delays. Every protest was met with a bureaucrat's shrug. The emperor was reduced not by battlefield defeat, but by paperwork denials and false assurances. It was justice as a mask polished, on the outside rotten beneath. The hypocrisy was staggering. Britain proclaimed itself the champion of liberty. Yet it treated the man who had once ruled Europe with indignities that mocked the very concept of fairness. Lowe paraded his strictness as duty, but in practice it was cruelty cloaked in order. And all the while the illness spread through Napoleon's body like a shadow no physician dared to name aloud. Outside Longwood, the world believed the British narrative. Newspapers painted him as a tyrant living in comfortable exile. Readers imagined him sipping wine beneath tropical palms. They did not smell the mould, or hear the coughing fits in the night, or see the emperor bent double in agony. They did not know how often he muttered the same phrase, "I am dying unjustly, and they call it law." Justice was the word stamped on his captivity. But when the walls dripped with damp, when poison gnawed his insides, when every plea was met with silence, justice was nothing more than a mask for murder. The night before the end was heavy with silence. Storm clouds bruised the horizon of Saint Helena, and the air inside Longwood carried the sickly weight of mildew and medicine. Napoleon had grown so frail that even lifting a spoon required effort. His attendants moved about in hushed tones, as if afraid sound itself might shatter what little life clung to him. His body had wasted away, but his mind, though clouded with pain, still reached across time. He asked for pen and paper, dictating fragments of his will. His voice rasped like dry leaves in the wind. He named his son the boy he had barely known, the King of Rome, who would inherit little more than a broken name. He asked that his ashes be returned to France to rest by the Seine, among the people who had once cheered him. The irony was cruel, a man who had crowned himself emperor, now begging simply for a grave in his homeland. As the candle burned low, he requested a simple meal broth, a sip of wine, a piece of bread. Each swallow was agony, the food turning to fire in his stomach. Yet he forced it down, clinging to ritual. It was not the banquet of an emperor, but the supper of a prisoner, and it left him weaker still. Those around him wept quietly, but Napoleon himself grew strangely calm. He spoke of France, of glory, of the army. Names tumbled from his lips, Marengo, Austerlitz, Jena, as if he were calling roll one final time. And then, softer still, he whispered a woman's name, Josephine. In that final vigil, it was not crowns or treaties he remembered, but the touch of a woman long gone. The hours bled away. He drifted in and out of sleep, his breath shallow, his skin clammy to the touch. At dawn, light crept weakly through the cracked shutters. A grey, listless dawn, the last he would ever see. He stirred his lips, forming words barely audible. France. Army. Head of the army. The fragments of a dream, a desperate tether to the life he once commanded. His companions leaned close, straining to catch every syllable, as though his last words might contain some hidden prophecy. But there was no prophecy, only longing. Longing for a country, a son, a love, a life that had already slipped away. That final sunrise did not blaze with glory. It seeped into the room like a ghost, illuminating the hollow face of a man who had once held Europe in his grasp. It revealed not a conqueror, but a mortal clinging to scraps of memory before surrendering them to silence. The room was suffocating. The shutters rattled in the wind, the damp air thick with the stench of sickness, of sweat, of medicine gone sour. Napoleon lay sprawled against the pillows, his body racked with convulsions. His attendants hovered helplessly, their hands trembling as they tried to ease his torment. It was not the sudden clean death of a soldier. It was a spectacle of cruelty, stretched hour by hour, minute by agonizing minute. He vomited dark liquid, thick and black, each wretch tearing his throat raw. His stomach burned as if molten lead coursed through it, his body twisting in spasms. He clawed at the sheets at his own chest as if he could dig out the poison that gnawed inside him. His once commanding voice had been reduced to groans and gasps, the sounds of a man being undone from within. The attendants whispered prayers, their words drowned by the rasping breaths of their master. His hair, already brittle, clung in damp strands to his forehead. Stray locks fell away onto the pillow, silent proof of the sickness consuming him. Later, those hairs would tell their own story, arsenic woven into every strand, a chemical ghost of murder. But in that moment, all that could be seen was a titan reduced to fragility, suffering in plain sight. The storm outside seemed to mirror the chaos within. Wind battered the walls, rain lashed against the glass, and the Atlantic roared like a beast just beyond the door. Inside, the air was heavy, stifling. His attendants dared not open a window. They feared the chill might extinguish the last flicker of life clinging to him. They could only watch powerless as the emperor who had marched across continents surrendered inch by inch to invisible agony. He tried to speak, his lips forming broken syllables, fragments of memories, half sentences that dissolved into cries of pain. At times, he cursed his enemies. At times, he whispered for Josephine. At times, he muttered of armies and banners, as though he still stood on a battlefield. But the battlefield was gone. The enemy was not Britain, not Lowe, not the Bourbon crown. The enemy was in his very blood, silent and merciless. The struggle dragged on for hours. His face grew waxen, his eyes hollow. He no longer resembled the man who had crowned himself in Notre Dame, or the commander who bent Europe to his will. Now he was just a man, one man broken and writhing under the weight of death. His body arched once more, a final convulsion, before it collapsed into stillness. The groans ceased. The silence that followed was deafening. Napoleon Bonaparte, emperor-conqueror, myth of Europe, had died, not with a roar of cannon, but with the pitiful gasps of a body slowly consumed, drop by poison or fate. His final moments were not triumph, but torment. And that torment, witnessed by the few who dared stay close, burned itself into history like a scar. The moment the emperor's chest ceased to rise, a terrible quiet descended upon Longwood House. The storm outside still howled, the Atlantic still roared, but inside that cramped room there was only stillness, so profound that every creak of the timbers, every whisper of fabric seemed like a shout. Men who had marched beside him, who had heard him command armies with iron certainty, now stood frozen, unable to move. They had watched Napoleon Bonaparte die, and the silence of that fact crushed the air from their lungs. One attendant covered his face with his hands. Another crossed himself and whispered a prayer. None dared to weep loudly. Even in death, the emperor demanded reverence, demanded awe. The British guard stationed outside heard the news carried on hushed voices, and for a brief moment even they stood still. Their prisoner was gone. Their enemy was gone. What remained was only a body, small and fragile, lying beneath sweat-soaked sheets. Governor Hudson Lowe received the message with studied detachment, but those who saw him swore that even his rigid mask faltered for a second. The great problem of his governorship, the name that haunted every report he sent to London, was solved. Yet victory over a corpse brought no glory. It left only a chill. Preparations began with ritual solemnity. The attendants washed the body, combed what little hair remained, and dressed him in the uniform of the chasseur of the Guard green coat, white breeches boots, polished as though for parade. Across his chest they draped the red ribbon of the Legion of Honour. Death had stripped him of empire, but they would not strip him of dignity. For one last time he looked like a soldier, not a prisoner. The coffin was prepared, plain and unadorned, lined with simple fabric. It seemed almost insulting, yet perhaps fitting, the man who had ruled palaces, now carried to rest in the soil of exile. On May the 9th, 1821, under the grey sky of Saint Helena, he was buried beneath a cluster of willow trees. The ground was damp, the air heavy, the island silent, save for the scrape of shovels. No trumpets, no cannon salutes, no parades of banners. Only the murmurs of a few loyal followers and the watchful eyes of British soldiers, ensuring even in death he did not escape. And yet the silence was not empty. It was heavy, suffocating, as though the island itself understood what had been taken from the world. Napoleon's grave was marked not with grandeur, but with anonymity, his name absent by British order. A conqueror who once bent kings to his will now lay beneath unmarked stone and willow shadows. But silence does not last forever. Beneath it, questions stirred. What truly killed him? Cancer, as the British insisted, or poison, as he himself whispered in his final days? The eerie stillness of that burial did not bury the doubts. Instead, it planted them seeds that would grow haunting history for generations. Years passed, but the silence of Saint Helena never truly ended. Instead, it echoed. It echoed in whispered speculation, in diaries and memoirs, in the hushed voices of those who had stood by his bed. Napoleon was gone, but the manner of his death refused to be buried. The British proclaimed the official story stomach cancer, the same disease that had claimed his father. It was convenient, tidy, clinical. Yet the people who had seen him in those final weeks remembered differently. They remembered the vomiting of black liquid, the hair falling away, the sudden swings between lucidity and delirium. They remembered his own voice rasping with pain, insisting again and again, "I am being poisoned." Decades later, the whispers grew louder. Strands of his preserved hair were tested, and inside them, scientists found traces of arsenic traces far beyond what nature could explain. Was it accidental exposure from dyes and wallpapers of the age? Or was it deliberate, each meal carrying the invisible hand of assassination? The evidence seemed to point toward murder, yet the culprit remained a shadow. The British authorities fearful he might escape and reignite Europe. The restored Bourbons in Paris desperate to ensure he would never return. Or someone closer bound to him by service, but tempted by betrayal. The irony is bitter. Napoleon, the man who shaped the fate of nations, who toppled dynasties, who crowned himself emperor against the will of kings and popes, may have been undone by something as small, as invisible as a handful of poison crystals. Not on the field of Austerlitz, not in the mud of Waterloo, but in a damp room where the ocean winds never ceased to gnaw at the shutters. And yet, death did not silence him. His name only grew heavier with legend. When his body was finally returned to Paris in 1840, 1 million people lined the streets to see his coffin. The Arc de Triomphe, once built to celebrate his victories, now bore witness to his return. He was laid to rest beneath the dome of Les Invalides, wrapped not in humiliation, but in glory, the crowd chanting his name as though he had never been defeated. But the question lingers, as it always will. Did Napoleon Bonaparte die a natural death, or was he murdered in silence? Did history's greatest conqueror succumb to fate or to the deliberate cruelty of men, too afraid to let him live? We will never know with certainty. What we do know is this: the cage of Saint Helena was not strong enough to hold his legend. The island took his body, but the whispers of poison, the image of an emperor betrayed by shadows, ensured that his story would never be contained. So we are left with the haunting echo, a man who once commanded Europe, gasping in a dark room, clutching his stomach, whispering, "They are poisoning me." Was it paranoia or prophecy? Perhaps history itself is the poison seeping endlessly reshaping truth until only mystery remains.